War destroys lives. But in this story, it created a love that refused to die. They say when someone's final wish remains unfinished, their soul never finds peace. But this time, it wasn't the soul that was trapped. It was the girl who spent the rest of her life waiting for someone who had already died. And even today, every midnight, someone still knocks on her door, exactly 3 times. For weeks, a brutal war had turned 2 neighboring countries into a living nightmare. Every day, the border echoed with gunfire, explosions, and smoke. No one knew if they would survive to see the next sunrise. Most villages near the border had already been abandoned. The few families who stayed alive rarely left their homes, hoping the war would end before it reached them. A few miles from the border stood a small house beside an empty road. 16-year-old Sayra lived there alone with her sick mother. Their home was far away from everyone else, so almost nobody ever came to visit. Every night before going to bed, Sayra locked every door, checked every window, and whispered the same prayer. "Please, let us live one more day." But that night felt different. At exactly 2:47 a.m., knock, knock, knock. Someone was at the door. Sayra's heart began to race. Who could possibly be outside in the middle of the night? She carefully looked through the window. Nothing, only darkness. A few seconds later, knock, knock, knock. The sound returned, softer than before, but somehow much more frightening. With trembling hands, Sayra slowly opened the door. Standing outside was a young soldier, no older than 23. His uniform was torn. Blood covered his body. One of his legs was badly injured, and he could barely stand. He looked into her eyes and whispered just 3 words. "Please, help me." Without wasting a second, Sayra helped the wounded soldier inside. He could barely walk. Every step left drops of blood across the wooden floor. She gently laid him on the bed and rushed to bring him some water. His hands were shaking. He took a few slow sips, but the pain was almost unbearable. When Sayra cleaned his injured leg, her face turned pale. The bullet had torn through the side of his leg, leaving a deep wound. She ripped an old piece of cloth into strips and carefully wrapped the injury. After a long silence, the soldier finally spoke. "My name is John. If you hadn't helped me, I don't think I would have survived tonight." Sayra gave him a small smile. "Names don't matter right now. Staying alive does. Just get some rest." John couldn't stop looking at her. He had never imagined that a complete stranger would risk everything to save him. Outside, the night grew darker. Then, knock, knock, knock. The same 3 knocks echoed through the house again. Sayra instantly froze. John looked at her. "Who's out there?" She whispered. "Whoever it is, don't go near the window." A few seconds later, the knocking suddenly stopped. But then, John heard something else. A faint voice, barely a whisper, calling his name from outside. "John." He slowly turned toward the window. There was nobody there, only darkness. The next morning, for the first time in days, John woke up feeling a little stronger. He watched Sayra quietly preparing medicine for her sick mother in the small kitchen. Even in the middle of a war, she still managed to smile. A few minutes later, she brought him some food. For a while, neither of them said a word. Finally, John broke the silence. "Why do you live all the way out here?" Sayra smiled softly. "Before the war, this place was full of families. Most of them left. My mother is too sick to travel, so I stayed with her." John looked down. For the first time, he realized that war destroyed innocent lives just as much as soldiers. Then, his eyes stopped on an old radio sitting in the corner of the room. Without anyone touching it, the radio suddenly turned on. Only loud static filled the room. Then, for just a few seconds, a broken voice whispered through the speaker, "Don't open it." The radio instantly went silent. John looked at Sayra. She didn't seem surprised, almost as if she had heard it before. "Did you hear that?" John asked. Sayra stayed quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "It has been doing that for months. After midnight, it sometimes turns on by itself. That's why I never touch it anymore." A cold chill ran down John's spine. He forced himself to believe it was just an old, damaged radio. He had no idea that this was only the beginning. After that night, John couldn't stop thinking about the strange voice from the radio. He kept telling himself it was nothing more than exhaustion. Over the next few days, his injuries slowly began to heal. He could finally walk around the house without much pain. Every morning, Sayra changed his bandages. She cooked for him. She also spent hours taking care of her sick mother. Little by little, They started talking for hours. About life before the war. About their dreams. About a world where people weren't forced to become enemies. One evening, Sayra was sitting outside, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. John quietly sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. Then, the roar of fighter jets echoed across the sky. A massive explosion shook the ground. The entire house trembled. Without thinking, Sayra grabbed John's hand. For the first time, they looked into each other's eyes. Neither of them said a single word, but both of them knew. Something had changed between them. Later that night, John searched for his torn military jacket. As he reached into one of the pockets, his military ID card slipped onto the floor. Sayra picked it up. She stared at it for several silent seconds. Then she looked at John. "You're an American soldier?" John's face turned pale. The room fell completely silent. At that moment, he believed he had just lost the only person who had ever shown him kindness. Sayra stared at John's military ID for several long seconds. The room was so quiet that they could hear each other's breathing. John slowly stood up. He lowered his head. "I never wanted to lie to you, but if I had told you the truth, you probably would have left me outside to die." Sayra didn't answer. She quietly walked to the window. Smoke still filled the distant sky. The war was far from over. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Wars are started by governments, not by ordinary people." John looked at her in disbelief. She smiled softly. "The night you knocked on my door, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a wounded man who needed help." John's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in his life, he felt kindness from someone who was supposed to hate him. From that day on, they grew even closer. Sayra often took him to the small garden behind the house. They spent hours talking. John shared stories about his childhood. Sayra spoke about the simple dreams she hoped to live one day. But every single night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the same 3 knocks returned. Knock, knock, knock. Now John heard them too. One night, he slowly looked outside through the window. There was nobody there, only a trail of burned footprints, leading across the wet ground, ending right in front of their door. The next morning, John quietly stepped outside. The burned footprints he had seen the night before were still there. He knelt down for a closer look. They looked human, but something was terribly wrong. There were no toes. It looked as if someone's feet had been completely burned away. The footprints continued toward the dark forest behind the house. John was about to follow them when he heard Sayra calling his name. John stopped. He turned around. She ran toward him, fear written all over her face. She grabbed his arm tightly. "Never follow those footprints." John looked confused. "Why?" Sayra stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she whispered, "Anyone who follows them never comes back." She quickly led him back inside the house. But that night, John couldn't sleep. The strange footprints kept replaying in his mind. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the 3 knocks returned. Knock, knock, knock. This time, John made a decision. He quietly got out of bed, carefully opened the front door, and stepped into the darkness, without waking Sayra. As soon as John stepped outside, he took a deep breath. The entire area was silent. Only the wind echoed through the empty trees. The burned footprints were still there. He slowly followed them. With every step, the air grew colder. A few minutes later, he reached the middle of the forest. Suddenly, the footprints ended beside an old burned tree. John looked around. Nobody was there. Then, a whisper came from behind him. "You're too late." John spun around. Nothing. His heart started pounding. A few feet away, a man stood with his back turned. His military uniform was completely burned. His body looked black as coal. Dark smoke slowly circled around him. John carefully stepped closer. Without turning around, the burned soldier spoke. "Go back. You still have time." The next second, the figure disappeared into the darkness like smoke. At that exact moment, John heard Sayra screaming his name from far away. "John, where are you?" John ran back toward the house as fast as he could. He had no idea that something had awakened that night, something that had been waiting for years. John ran back toward the house as fast as he could. The entire way, he felt like someone was following him. Every time he looked back, nobody was there, only the wind and the sound of the trees. A few minutes later, he reached the house. Sayra was standing outside in tears. The moment she saw him, she ran over and hugged him. "Are you out of your mind? I told you never to leave the house at night." John stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he told her everything. The burned soldier, the strange warning, and how the figure disappeared into the darkness. As John spoke, the color slowly faded from Sayra's face. Her hands began to shake. After a long silence, she whispered, "You saw him." John looked at her. "Do you know who he is?" Sayra lowered her head. Tears filled her eyes. "People have talked about him ever since I was a little girl. They say the souls of soldiers who died during the war still wander through those woods, and anyone who sees them is never the same again." John didn't know what to say. Then, the 3 knocks returned. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the front door slowly began to open. All by itself, the front door slowly creaked open on its own. Sayra and John stood frozen. The door opened all the way, but no one was outside. Only darkness and a freezing wind. Then, the smell of burned wood filled the house. John carefully stepped toward the doorway. The same burned footprints were there again, but this time, they weren't leading away from the house. They were leading inside. John's heart pounded. It felt as if something invisible was already inside the home. Suddenly, the old ceiling light began to flicker. On, off, on, off. Strange shadows danced across the walls. Sayra grabbed John's hands so tightly that she could barely breathe. Then, a slow sound echoed from upstairs. Step, step, step. John looked toward the staircase. Nobody ever went upstairs. The room had been empty for years. He picked up a flashlight. Sayra held his arm. "Don't go." But John had already started walking toward the stairs. John slowly climbed the staircase. Every step made the old wood creak beneath his feet. Creak, creak. The house was completely silent. Only the beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness. At the end of the hallway, one bedroom door stood slightly open. A faint sound, almost like someone crying, was coming from inside. John slowly pushed the door open. The room was empty. There was only an old wooden chair and a large dusty mirror against the wall. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror became covered with fog. John stepped closer. He wiped the glass with his hand. At first, he saw only his own reflection. Then, something appeared behind him. A burned soldier. Half of his face had melted away. His eyes were completely white. John instantly turned around. Nobody was there. His heart pounded as he looked back at the mirror. The burned soldier was still standing behind him, slowly raising one hand, pointing toward John's shoulder. John's entire body froze. With trembling breath, he slowly began to look behind him. The moment John looked behind him, nobody was there. But in the broken mirror, the burned soldier was still standing. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed toward the window. The next second, crash. The mirror exploded into hundreds of pieces. John stumbled backward. Then he heard Sayra screaming from downstairs. "John, get down here." He ran down the stairs as fast as he could. Outside, several military trucks had surrounded the house. Armed soldiers were everywhere. Bright flashlights lit up every window. Sayra's face had turned completely pale. She looked at John. "They found you." John immediately realized there was almost no way out. He rushed toward the back door. More soldiers were already waiting there. Then, a powerful kick slammed into the front door. Bang! The door crashed to the floor. Nearly a dozen soldiers stormed inside. They searched every room. Sayra desperately tried to stop them. "Please, there's no one here." Nobody listened. Then, one soldier noticed the blood-soaked bandages lying on the floor. He shouted, "He's here." Within seconds, the quiet house exploded into chaos. John quickly hid in the corner of the room. Sayra stepped in front of the soldiers. Her voice trembled. "There's no one here. Please leave." No one listened. The soldiers tore the house apart. They searched every room, every cabinet, every corner. Then, a loud crack echoed from upstairs. One of the soldiers shouted, "Someone's up there." Within seconds, they rushed toward the second floor. John knew it was over. Slowly, he stepped out from his hiding place. The soldiers immediately tackled him to the ground. They tied his hands behind his back. One of them punched him hard across the face. Blood ran from John's mouth. Sayra screamed and ran toward them. "Stop, please." He didn't do anything. A soldier shoved her so hard that she crashed into the wall. Her sick mother tried to get out of bed, but she was too weak to help. John couldn't take his eyes off Sayra. He wasn't afraid. He was heartbroken. Deep inside, he knew this might be the last time they would ever see each other. As the soldiers dragged him outside, John looked back one final time. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They already understood everything. The soldiers dragged John away from the house. Barefoot, Sayra ran after them. Tears streamed down her face. She begged over and over, "Please, let him go. He hasn't hurt anyone." No one listened. John's hands were tied behind his back. As they marched forward, he looked back at Sayra one last time. A faint smile crossed his face, as if he wanted her to stay strong. A few minutes later, the soldiers stopped at an abandoned battlefield. Burned military vehicles, destroyed tanks, and massive bomb craters covered the ground. Only days earlier, a missile strike had turned the entire area into ruins. The soldiers forced John onto his knees. Their commander stepped forward. He stared directly into John's eyes. "Why did you cross our border?" John remained silent. The commander asked again. Still, John said nothing. Without warning, the commander punched him hard across the face. John collapsed onto the ground. But even then, he refused to speak. From a distance, Sayra watched everything. She broke free and ran toward him. Before she could reach him, two soldiers grabbed her. Crying uncontrollably, she begged them again, "Please don't kill him. He's not a bad person." But no one showed any mercy. Sayra fought desperately to break free. Her cries echoed across the ruined battlefield. "Please, let him go. He didn't save just my life. He became my life." No one listened. The commander raised his hand. Two soldiers forced John to his knees in front of the wreckage of a burned fighter jet. John remained silent. He looked at Sayra one last time. There was no fear in his eyes, only regret. He smiled faintly. "Sayra, I'm sorry." Tears poured down her face. "No, don't say that. I'll get you out of here. I'll find a way." John gently shook his head. "If we can't be together in this life, maybe we'll meet in another." Sayra couldn't stop crying. The commander gave another order. The soldiers tightened their grip on John. Every time Sayra tried to run toward him, she was pulled back. Then, a powerful wind swept across the battlefield. Dust began swirling around the burned wreckage. Even a few soldiers looked around nervously. John lifted his eyes toward the sky. Then he looked at Sayra one final time. Barely above a whisper, he said, "I love you." "John!" Sayra screamed. At that exact moment, the entire battlefield fell into a terrifying silence. An unnatural silence covered the battlefield. A freezing wind swept across the ruins. Dark clouds rolled over the sky. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. John remained on his knees. His eyes never left Sayra. He smiled one last time, wanting his final memory to be her face. The commander lowered his hand without a word. The soldiers moved forward. Sayra struggled with everything she had. "No, please. Don't take him away." Her cries echoed across the empty battlefield. Moments later, John's voice was gone forever. Silence returned. Sayra collapsed onto the ground. Tears streamed endlessly down her face. It felt as though her entire world had disappeared with him. Then, the wind suddenly became stronger. Ash and dust rose into the air around the wreckage. The temperature dropped without warning. Several soldiers stepped back nervously. One of them whispered, "Why did it suddenly get so cold?" Then, for just a single second, a dark shadow slowly rose from the ruins and disappeared into the darkness. Only one person saw it: Sayra. After John's death, the soldiers arrested Sayra. She was accused of hiding an enemy soldier. She cried. She begged. She tried to explain, but no one believed her. Months behind bars slowly became years. When she was finally released, she returned to the only place she had ever called home. Everything had changed. The walls were cracked. Tall weeds covered the yard. And the person she wanted to see the most was gone. An elderly neighbor quietly told her, "A few months after you were taken away, your mother passed away, calling your name until the very end." Sayra's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed at the front door. For a long time, she couldn't stop crying. Now, she had no mother, no John, and no reason left to live. Life slowly became an empty routine. She worked during the day, and every night returned alone to the silent house. But after a few weeks, something felt wrong. Sometimes she heard dishes moving inside the kitchen. Sometimes, slow footsteps echoed from the empty upstairs room. And every now and then, she felt someone standing directly behind her, watching, without making a sound. Whenever she turned around, no one was there. She had no idea. Her worst nightmare had only just begun. About a month had passed since Sayra returned home. She wasn't the same person anymore. She barely spoke to anyone. Every evening, She locked every door before the sun went down. But every night, she felt someone standing outside, watching, waiting. That night, the full moon lit the empty road. The clock read exactly 3:13 a.m. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks. Exactly like the night John had first arrived at her door. Sayra's entire body froze. She whispered to herself, "It's only in my head." A few seconds later, the knocks returned. Knock, knock, knock. Then, a faint voice came from outside. So quiet, it almost disappeared into the wind. Sayra, she stopped breathing. The voice came again. This time, she heard every word. "Sayra, I'm thirsty. Will you give me some water?" It was a voice she could never forget. John's voice. The same words he had spoken on the night they first met. Tears filled her eyes. Slowly, she walked toward the front door. Her trembling hand reached for the lock. Then, a thin line of black ash slid beneath the door and slowly crept into the house. Sayra stood in front of the door for several long minutes. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The voice came again. "Sayra, please, open the door. Open the door. Open the door."